Hi friends, this is Nipunika Shahid and the subject expert for today's topic is Dr. Manu Sharma. She has been working as an assistant professor with Amity School of Communication. I welcome you all to a session on the print media in India in 19th century. In this session, we'll talk about the different newspapers that found their birth, development as well as ending during later half of 18th century and the entire 19th century starting from the first Indian newspaper. We'll also talk about the central ideas that were propagated through these newspapers. To start with, we can say that the growth as well as the development of journalism in India has had a checkered history. In India, journalism was a product of struggle against the continuing repressive measures of the British rulers over a long period of time, and despite the strict laws was nurtured by some of the great men this country has produced, including the freedom fighters, social reformers, intellectuals and men of letters who gave their best to the expansion of media, especially the press. Now, if you've been thinking that the first Indian newspaper was an Indian initiative, then you're absolutely wrong. The first major newspaper in India, the Bengal Gazette, was started in 1780 under the British Raj by James Augustus Hickey. It was published from Kolkata, then known as Calcutta, for 2 years. Other newspapers such as the Indian Gazette, the Calcutta Gazette, the Madras Korea, 1785, the Bombay Herald, 1789, etc. soon followed. If we go back to the history of the Bengal Gazette, then it can be said that the East India Company was totally and entirely against the starting of any newspaper in India, so that their war secrets were not exposed to their enemies. James Augustus Hickey was a pioneer in Indian journalism. Though considered as a highly eccentric Irishman who had previously spent 2 years in jail for debt, still he was the first one who brought out the first Indian Journal of India in English language. The Bengal Gazette was first English language newspaper and indeed the first printed newspaper to be published in the Indian subcontinent. The paper was a 3-column paper and its size was 12 by 8 inches and it was a weekly. The motive behind the paper, as claimed by Hickey, was not any particular passion for printing newspaper, as he felt that he was not bred to a slavish life of hard work. Yet, he took pleasure in enslaving his body in order to purchase freedom of his mind and soul. Later on, Hickey was forced to close the paper. The post-Hickey writers condemned him for vulgar and scurrilous writing and failure to guard against negative writing. Hickey had once stated in his paper that there was something so sneaky and treacherous in going on in secret to take the advantage of a good-natured woman, to draw into a promise to getting that done which I knew would be highly improper to ask her husband, though his unfounded love for his wife could induce him to comply with. The woman he was talking about was Mrs. Warren Hastings and her husband was Mr. Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India during that time. Hickey was labelled as a tenacious character, not particularly interested in money. It is felt that had he kept up a moderate tone in his paper, he could have achieved a grand success for his claims. He, however, couldn't be brought over. Despite his faults, he was a pioneer. Also, the newspaper soon became very famous not only among the British soldiers posted in India at that time, but it also inspired the Indians to write newspapers of their own. Contents of Hickey's paper included 1. Hickey's address to public. 2. Abstracts from an English newspaper published in England. 3. poetry and plays. 4. Gossips and scandals. 5th. Socio-cultural criticisms. During his time, he also criticized Chief Justice Mr. Impey for entering into a contract with Mr. Hastings to collect wealth through unfair means. On June 17, 1781, the Chief Justice sent him arrest warrants, but he thwarted it. An army of more than 50 people was sent to arrest him, and then he produced himself before the court, where he was detained and asked to pay a huge amount in the shape of bail. Warren Hastings exhausted his patience, and Hickey was convicted with a year's imprisonment and a fine of Rs 2,000. When Hickey was in prison, he continued to get his Gazette published with the help of his friends, and there was no let-up in his aggressive tone. He started the personal attack more vigorously, and he started labeling both Warren Hastings and Impey as the enemies of freedom of press. He used to hold in contempt rich ladies as a target of social satire. In March 1782, 4 fresh legal petitions were initiated against Hickey by Hastings, including one demanding closing of his press. Warren Hastings was rejected when the court held that this would amount to violation of Constitution. A fresh petition, however, resulted in seizure of his types, terminating Gassett's life. Finally, the paper ceased publication on March 23, 1782. The memorist William Hickey, who confusingly was not in fact related to the paper's founder, describes its establishment shortly after he had succeeded in his capacity as an attorney at law in having James Hickey released from debtors. At the time I first saw Hickey, he had been about 7 years in India. During his confinement, he met with the treatise upon printing, from which he collected sufficient information to commence as a printer, there never having been a press in Calcutta. It occurred to Hickey that great benefit might arise from setting on foot a public newspaper, nothing of that kind ever having appeared. Therefore, he issued proposals for printing a weekly newspaper, which, meeting with extraordinary encouragement, he speedily issued his first work. As a novelty, every person read it and was delighted. Possessing a fund of low wit, his paper abounded with proof of that talent. He had also a happy knack at applying appropriate nicknames and relating satirical anecdotes. Then second in the league was Calcutta Journal, started by James Silk Buckingham. James infused a new light to Indian journalism. He was the pioneer among the Europeans who fought for liberal press in India. He was born at Flushing, near Falmouth, the son of a farmer, and had a limited education. His youth was spent at sea, and in 1797 he was captured by the French and held as a prisoner of war at Corunna. In 1821, his Travels in Palestine were published, followed by Travels among the Arab tribes in 1825. After years of wandering, he settled in India, where he established a periodical, the Calcutta Journal, in 1818. James never over-criticized the government, but did publish the flaws in government functioning to attract public attention. And like a true journalist, he supported his comments with facts and figures, which was a nuisance for the government as they couldn't deny the substantial details. As compared to Hickey, James gave people new perspectives about the government. Interestingly, he was the first one to use illustrations and pictures to oppose Sati system. It was a complete and a balanced journal as it covered all the aspects of political, cultural and social lives of people. This was the first journal that had a certain amount of definitiveness and certainty as compared to very fragile dividing press of that era, which was corrupted by malice and personal biasness. Calcutta Journal was a highly successful venture in the beginning, but in 1823, the paper's outspoken criticisms of the East India Company led to the expulsion of Buckingham from India and to the suppression of the paper by John Adam, the acting Governor-General in 1823. His case was brought before a select committee of the House of Commons in 1834, and a pension of £500 a year was subsequently awarded to him by the East India Company as compensation. Buckingham continued his journalistic ventures on his return to England. He settled at Cornwall Terrace, Regent's Park, and started the Oriental Herald and Colonial Review 1824–29 and the Athenaeum 1828, which was not a success in his hands. Now, after the contributions of these two pioneers, let's talk about the Indian press growth and development in late 18th and the entire 19th century. First one would be the Indian Gazette. Before Hickey's Bengal Gazette completed 10 months, a rival paper called the Indian Gazette was started by B. Messing in 1781. Messing was connected with the theatre along with the salt merchant of Calcutta called Peter Reed. This paper was actually started by the British government to counter the attacks of Hickey. Maybe due to this reason, India's second newspaper was promptly rewarded by Warren Hastings for its sobriety and loyalty with the privilege of circulation through the post office free of postage. The Indian Gazette did not, however, survive for long. Then came the Calcutta Gazette, which is the oldest surviving newspaper in India, and it is the paper which started publication at least 3 years before the Times, London, and still continues. Calcutta Gazette has completed 200 years of its publication this year. As far as the history of the publication goes, the 1780s witnessed the birth and unprecedented advancement of journalism in India. And Calcutta, as the capital of British India, naturally took the lead. Though Portuguese missionaries had brought the first printing press to Goa as early as 1557, there was no newspaper or journal in India until January 29, 1780, when James Augustus Hickey ventured to bring out his controversial Bengal Gazette from Calcutta. The Calcutta Gazette was the brainchild of a brilliant individual, Francis Gladwin. A pioneering Orientalist and lexicographer, Gladwin was a civil servant who thought far ahead of his time. He was the first professor of Persian at the Fort William College in Calcutta, which Lord Wellesley founded for the proper training of the company's griffins as soon as they reached India. It was because of Gladwin's efforts that the Calcutta Gazette was born on the 4th of March, exactly 200 years ago in Calcutta. Like its two forerunners, the Calcutta Gazette was also a weekly and was published on Thursdays, and till today, the major publications of the Calcutta Gazette are brought out on Thursdays. Third one would be the Madras Korea, and it was the first newspaper to be published in Madras Presidency. It first appeared in the English language on October 12, 1785. It was started by Richard Johnston. The Madras Courier was followed by the weeklies, the Madras Gazette and the Government Gazette in 1795. The Spectator, founded in 1836, was the first English newspaper in Chennai to be owned by an Indian and became the city's first daily newspaper in 1853. And finally, the first Tamil newspaper, Swadesamitran, was launched in 1899. So far, we've covered Calcutta and Madras. Now let's talk about Mumbai or Bombay as it was known then. The Bombay Herald was the first English newspaper in Bombay. It was started in 1789. After this, Bombay Courier was started in the following year 1790. In 1791, the name of Bombay Herald was changed to Bombay Gazette. Bombay Courier was published on Saturdays and Gasset on Wednesdays. While Bombay Courier continued to exist for 56 years, after which it was merged with Bombay Telegraph, Bombay Gazette on the other hand stopped its operation in 1842. Both these papers contained almost entirely parts from English papers and occasional law reports. The first native newspaper in Bombay was Bombay Samachar that was started in 1822. This paper was started as a weekly. It became a bi-weekly in 1833 and daily in 1860, followed by Mumbai Kirkman, which was started in 1830. Then came an Indian initiative, Bengal Gazette. It was the first newspaper under Indian administration which appeared in 1816. It was published by Gangadhar Bhattacharjee and was a liberal paper which advocated the reforms of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Now that I have mentioned Raja Ram Mohan Roy, let's talk about his contributions in the expansion of Indian print media. Sambaad Comedy was a magazine started in Bengali by Raja Ram Mohan Roy in 1821. In this magazine, he wrote several articles opposing Sati system and other social systems prevailing in India. It was a Bengali weekly newspaper. Although Ram Mohan Roy was the owner, Comedy was actually published in the name of Bhavani Charan Bandyopadhyay. The first issue of Sambaad Comedy appeared on December 4, 1821. It contained an appeal to the Bengali public in which it proclaimed that the primary object of its publication was to promote the public good. On December 20, 1821, the Calcutta Journal brought out an editorial commenting on the publication of this new Bengali newspaper edited by a learned Hindu. During the same time, there was Miratul Akhbar, which was a Persian language journal founded and edited by Raja Ram Mohan Roy in 1822. With the inspiration of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, 3 more newspapers continued their publication between 1821 to 1891. They were The Reformer, The Inquirer and Gyan Anveshan. All these newspapers were the promoters of Hinduism. Samachar Turpin was a Bengali weekly newspaper published by the Baptist Missionary Society from the Baptist Mission Press at Serampore in the first half of the 19th century. It is considered to be the first Indian language newspaper, although some historians contend that the Bengali weekly Bingle Cassatt, published by Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya, had begun publication earlier. The success of the Bengali monthly Digdarshan encouraged the missionaries of the Baptist Missionary Society to embark on a new venture, the publication of a Bengali newspaper. The initiative was taken by Joshua Marshman and William Watt. At about the same time, Harichandra Roy was also planning to start a Bengali newspaper from his own printing press at Choribagan Street in Calcutta. But before he could bring out his publication, the missionaries published the first issue of Samachar Turpin from the Baptist Mission Press at Serampore on May 23, 1818. The newspaper was published every Saturday and was edited by John Clark Marshman and contained news, both Indian and European, collected from various sources, particularly from English newspapers. It also contained brief articles on various subjects. It carried some material of educational value which made it respected and popular among the educated people. Both in typography and contents, the Samachar Turpin maintained a fairly good standard. Its coverage of local news was certainly better than any other English or Indian language newspaper. By reprinting news and comments from other Bengali newspapers, the Samachar Turpin enabled its readers to have acquaintance with the different sections of the Bengali opinion. In December 1841, the missionaries decided to discontinue the publication that ended with the last issue of December. The official reason stated was that John Clark Marshman, who was still the editor of the newspaper, couldn't find sufficient time owing to other preoccupations. But the actual reason was that the Samachar Turpin, though very successful as a newspaper, had failed miserably in its primary objective, which was the propagation of Christianity. Now this one would be an interesting piece of information. A paper named Samachar Chandrika was started in 1921 by B.C. Bandyopadhyay, who was the colleague of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. When Raja Ram Mohan Roy started attacking social evils, he parted ways with him as he believed that tradition is sacred. To avoid the controversy between two papers, Raja Ram Mohan Roy stopped the publication of Sambat Comedy in 1822, but restarted it in 1823 when attacks from Samachar Chandrika stopped. Now for its history, the first issue of Samachar Chandrika came out on 5th March 1822. After the publication of the first two issues, Bhavani Charan published an advertisement announcing Samachar Chandrika's arrival in the market in Serampur's Samachar Turpin. In April 1829, Samachar Chandrika began coming out twice a week instead of once. Its publication started on January 1, 1835 and continued till December 1876. It was weekly edition which was incorporated with the Indian Statesman April 75 onwards. Apart from these newspapers, there was the Indian Mirror, a fortnightly and was an important newspaper that was founded as well as edited by Manmohan Ghosh. In 1871, Keshav Chandra took over its responsibility. He also started another Bengali newspaper known as Sulabh Samachar. Most of you would have never heard about this paper. Viewers, the Statesman is a direct descendant of two newspapers, The Englishman and The Friend of India, both published in Calcutta, now Kolkata. The Englishman was started in 1811 by Robert Knight, who was previously the principal founder and editor of the Times of India. Knight founded The Statesman and New Friend of India on 15th January 1875, which later adopted the current name. The Statesman was managed by a British corporate group until it transferred ownership to an Indian company in the mid-1960s. The first editor assigned under this new ownership was Pran Chopra. Now, as far as the story of first Hindi newspaper is concerned, it was Odent Martin and was published in 1826 from Bengal. However, it could not survive long because of its distant readership and high postal rates. Its place was soon taken by Jam-e-Jahan Numa, a newspaper that was pro-establishment. A large number of short-lived newspapers were brought out in this time. Some were in Indian languages like Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, Urdu and Persian. For an instance, in 1832, Bal Shastri Jambhekar launched an Anglo-Marathi newspaper from Pune. Then there was Sambat Prabhakar, which was a Bengali daily newspaper founded by Ishwar Chandra Gupta and published in the first half of the 19th century. It began as a weekly newspaper in 1831 and became a daily 8 years later in 1839. It was the first Bengali daily newspaper. Sambat Prabhakar covered news on India and abroad and put forward its views on religion, politics, society and literature. In 1836, the newspaper was revived by Ishwar Chandra Gupta and appeared as a tri-weekly. So, despite controversies and repressive laws being passed by British government, 49 newspapers began from Bengal to Bombay between 1831 to 33. Out of these, 33 were in English and 16 in Bengali, though the main idea behind majority of the papers was popularity of English language. Then in 1875, we had Amrit Bazar Patrika. It started out as a vernacular paper, but was constantly in trouble due to its outspokenness. In order to circumvent the strict provision of the Vernacular Press Act, Amrit Bazar Patrika converted itself overnight into an English newspaper. Amrit Bazar Patrika further inspired freedom fighter Lokmanya Tilak to start Kesari in Pune. He used Kesari to build anti-cow killing societies, Ganesh mandals and reviving the Chhatrapati Shivaji cult. He used mass communication as a powerful political weapon. Then the growth of political journalism can be traced back to 1861, when the Indian Council Act empowered the government to nominate distinguished Indians to legislature. Many of the great Indian newspapers, which flourish even today, were established during this period, like the Times of India 1861, the Hindu 1878 and the Tribune. Now the entire discussion can be concluded by saying that compared with many other developing countries, the Indian press has flourished since independence and exercises a large degree of independence today. British colonialism allowed for the development of a tradition of freedom of press, and many of India's great English language newspapers and some of its Indian language press were begun during the 19th century. As India became independent, ownership of India's leading English language newspapers was transferred from British to Indian business groups, and the fact that most English language newspapers have the backing of large business houses has contributed to their independence from the government till date. Hope that through this session, you would have come to know about so many new names associated with the Indian press and the interesting facts behind them. I'll see you again with another interesting session. Until then, goodbye.